We've had all eyes on Jesus for the past few months already. As we go through Luke's gospel, we're finally in chapter 9, and we're learning some interesting things about what Jesus does in unusual circumstances. A killer storm that he stops in its tracks, a demonized lunatic who he sends out as a missionary, an afflicted woman who found healing by simply touching the hem of the robe of Jesus, or the 12-year-old girl who dies, and Jesus raises her with just two confident words, "Child, arise." We're all challenged to try to be like Jesus, to become like Jesus, but there's not much in any of these situations that we could have done, any of us, if we encountered anything similar. And today we have Jesus feeding 5,000 people. Thousands of hungry people. We might also think that there's nothing here for us to learn, anything that we could do like him because, well, obviously we're going to be impressed by Jesus. That's a big deal here. And that causes us to trust him more and depend on him, and that's all good. And that's actually probably the main point of this whole chapter and everything that's going on here. We're going to learn that powerfully next week. We need to know who he is. And this miracle tells us a lot about that. But look, we're not ever likely to be faced with a problem on the same scale as Jesus here, and we should admit that we wouldn't be able to do what Jesus did, feed thousands with a miracle. Tell me it's not just me. So let's figure out how this passage fits for us. And here's what I'm thinking about, something that Jesus does here that we can put into action. Today we're going to watch how Jesus deals with people who use him as a meal ticket. They don't really understand who he is. They're largely ungrateful for his help on any deep level. In other words, people who maybe are a lot like your kids with you. Today I preach to the overworked and the underappreciated. And I think there's something here for guys on Father's Day. Well, most of you have people in your life that you do something for and they hardly notice. So here's our first question we're going to start with. How do you react when people expect a lot from you, but they don't bother to express much appreciation when you come through for them? You're there for them, but they just sort of take you for granted. Well, there's a regrettable but unsurprising thing about faithfulness, and we're going to call this the downside of faithfulness. If you just showed up sporadically to like wash your wife's car, or read your kid a book, you might get a big thank you with a hug, but just try being faithful and as predictable as a Hallmark movie plot. And then you would slide eventually into a different territory, the country of the expected. And in that country, ingratitude reigns as queen. Your amazing kindnesses start getting taken for granted, almost ignored. Well, now because it's Father's Day, I've chosen to focus on men today. So let's say that your wife let's say that she has a shallow impression of all the amazing sacrifices you make to provide for the family. It's just what you've already done. And you show up with a paycheck on Friday, and she doesn't say, "You're amazing. This is amazing. Thank you so much." Now, I want to apologize in advance because in thinking through this sermon, I realized if I was a woman sitting, I'm talking to men, so I'm thinking about what they need to hear, but you wives, you could think I'm dumping on you in this message because I'm going to talk about ungrateful women. And I know a lot of you, and you're just not that way, so I don't want you to take it that way, but I'm talking to your husband who could think that you are, who could be a victim of what I'm going to call toxic masculine craving for admiration and attention. TMCAA, I just invented a new syndrome. And this is just how men tend to react when their brains are still screwed on a little bit sideways. So we're going to try to unscrew them and put them on right. By the time we end this, I hope that you're more grateful for your husband. That would be nice. But for you guys, that you kind of learn what this is, kind of how this works by looking at Jesus. And so, there's so many ways I could talk about this. I mean, you want to impress your wife. There was a guy that I read about this. It was in the news a few years back. A teacher in Oklahoma who had run out of ways for his wife to notice him. So he was a creative teacher, and he hired two husky teenagers to $100 each to break into his house and tie up his wife. And after she was bound with duct tape, the gallant husband raced in and he fought off the intruders, even pre-cut a board so that he could whack one of them over the head with it, and it would break. Now, how many wives here would be impressed with that kind of contrived rescue? I thought so, yeah. I want you to think carefully about the people that Jesus was dealing with in today's passage. On the whole, they are not seeing any deeper into life than their physical needs. They have no idea who Jesus really is. These hungry people prove that could be a very large crowd who sees a very amazing miracle, who could get very enthused about Jesus, but it only goes about that deep because really Jesus said it like this in John 6, "You're seeking me because you ate your fill of the loaves." Now, some of my comments today will reflect on the other Gospels. This is the only Gospel that's actually in all four Gospels except for the resurrection of Christ. So there's a reason for that. And when you compare them, you pick up some different insights about, okay, what's really going on here? And you may not think that people wanting to haul Jesus to Jerusalem on their shoulders to enthrone him as a king would be called ungrateful. But you have to realize this is about as shallow as a kid's wading pool. These men who showed up at this will all be required by Mosaic law to show up in Jerusalem at the very time Jesus is being crucified, at Passover. And here they are, and not one of them will stand up for Jesus at his trial. It's not unreasonable to suggest some of them will actually be among the crowds who shout, "We have no king but Caesar." So there's that. And then we'll see that even the disciples do not understand the real lesson of this miracle because their hearts were hardened. Mark tells us in Mark 6:52, their hearts were closed to really understanding what's going on. So we're going to try our hardest to have soft hearts and learn some important lessons from this astounding miracle, even if they didn't. And maybe today we'll see the hearts of some husbands turned toward their wives and maybe vice versa. Because face it, wives, your wife, even a wonderful wife, will never know, let alone appreciate all that you do for her. But I call you and me to a higher template of ministry, a model of love-saturated servanthood that we see in Jesus, a model that propelled him all the way to the cross. Now, his brand of servanthood breaks down into some rare and beautiful virtues, and you can start asking yourself as we go along whether these components are there in the way that you minister to your wife. And so we're going to look from this at this passage, and we're going to learn the servant heart of Jesus, and there'll be four parts to this. See, the impact of this miracle is not just in the power of it, what I wrote down, the miraculous molecular multiplication of it, but in the display of his humble and caring heart, and that's what we want to see. We start out with this in Luke chapter 9, verse 10. On the return, the apostles told him all that they had done. Now remember that Jesus had sent out his men into the villages of Galilee where they had preached and they had healed and cast out demons in Jesus' name. And then after a few days, they came back with a report. The master concludes that at that point, they are all tired and spent and whatever. They need some team time to reset and refresh and debrief. Well, Mark tells us that so many people kept thronging around them at this point that they had to escape in a boat and find a secluded place, or let's try to find one where they could shelter in private. Didn't work out so well. But they're so inundated with demands that they don't even have time to eat, which is really interesting because we're going to have this huge feeding miracle. And here they are serving, and they don't even have time to refresh themselves with food. And so it says, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. Now, the map here shows, I have a little circle around where Bethsaida is. You can see it's not far from Capernaum on that north shore of what we call the Sea of Galilee. When the crowds learned it, that is where he was going, they followed him. Actually, we found out in the other Gospels that they actually got there before he did, or they did in the boat. And the people are like, they treat him like a Hollywood celebrity. You can't go to lunch without the paparazzi drooling all over him. But they all set out on foot, and here they are. When he gets there, and it says, and he welcomed them. He welcomed them. That is really a profound statement because I guess that would be a miracle in itself because we know how natural people, when they are tired and hungry, this is hardly what they want to do, is do more work with people. But Jesus, instead of resenting them for interrupting the much-needed, well-deserved retreat that they were on, he welcomed them. He opened his arms to them and met their expectations, even though he and his guys are already drained. And he spoke to them of the kingdom of God, and he cured those who had need of healing. Now, I want you to see one thing from these verses as we start out with, and this is the first thing, availability. Jesus has apparently been ministering all along. This is what he always did. While his guys were away, he kept busy. That he was ministering to crowds, and they would just plot people in front of him and expect him to do his thing. Not one indication of a please or a thank you, but in spite of that, Jesus is always willing to respond to the obvious needs that lay at his feet, the many needs that people just expected him to meet. No difference here in verse 11. And I look at that, and as we've kind of set up this sermon today, I should be asking how I can be available to meet the needs of my wife, the ones that she expects me to meet. And there she is over there. I was hoping you wouldn't come today, but anyway. But I should try to be like Jesus to her. Now, what lies at your feet, guys? Obvious things that she looks to you to do for her, not the stuff that she expects you to read her mind for, but the leaky faucet that's been, it's been 2 months and you haven't done a thing, or the door that never closes right, or this is on her list already, but anyway, or the special date that you promised. Could be anything. Have you let any of those slip by undone because of, laziness or selfishness, basic things, but maybe because she seemed ungrateful for your past attempts, or got naggy about it? Or have you yanked away the welcome mat that you once threw down like a red carpet when you were courting the woman of your dreams? And when any little thing came up and you jumped in, Johnny, on the spot. I don't know if James, is my son James here? Raise your hand. I don't see him where he is. Okay, there he is. So he was flipped for Jenny. And she was coming to church. She was a student at POU, and he found out that her computer was kind of glitchy. So he volunteered to help, fix it for her. When he gave it back to her, he had totally rebuilt her computer with all new, fast working, big memory, all the stuff that her computer didn't have. He did all of that. He wasn't asked, because he was in red carpet mode. The welcome mat was out. That's the heart you want when you're looking for a husband. Okay, so here's where I should pull out the Gordon MacDonald quote that I love and hate. You can tell whether you're becoming a servant by how you react when someone treats you like one. Now that's refrigerator door material, post it where everyone can read it, but especially you guys. But let's say that she has a legitimate stuff she expects you to do for her, and the saints that she is will, of course, give up all those expectations, commit them all to God, as a highly mature Christian woman should, so she can be genuinely grateful every time you do even the smallest thing and not lose patience when you don't. But what if your wife never gets around to getting that mature? What if her maturity is a little stunted? She has needs, she just plops them down at your feet when you come home after a hard day at work, and either at your feet or in your face, and then you got to decide what to do. Ignore her, argue with her, avoid her, postpone her. Honey, I'll get to it as soon as, then you kind of mumble and catch up on these 64 ball games that I recorded. And so then I have to ask guys, what's your ideal wife? Does she look like this? She does all the serving and you do all the consuming. She does all the giving and you do all the taking. And that's not right. I mean, a little bit about Jesus, that Jesus never heard of that kind of ministry. This is the way he talked about himself. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life, a ransom for many. And he happened to be the one who made the universe. And yet that was his view of himself as he came to be, we'll just call him the ideal husband. So I want us guys to start accepting that same job title that the almighty Jesus tagged on himself, servant. We could add name tags today out there, but every one of you put on, my name is servant, I am servant. And what that label comes to is kind of a resolution. And I don't know if I stated this very well, but the resolution is this: I plan to give more than I feel I get back, because this is good and godly. And I could add some words to that. I plan to give what I feel is more than I feel I get back. Because in reality, actually, it might be impossible to outgive a devoted wife. It's just that what she returns in the way of gratitude or admiration may be less than my flesh longs for. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about here, but I'm not going to let that stop me from serving her. What I think, oh, she's not thanking me enough. She doesn't admire me enough. No, I'm going to give more. I will keep giving even when that's not there because it is good. And it is good because it's godly, it's godlike. And I'm sure you know that God never gets back anything approaching to what he hands out as blessings. Not nearly the worship, not nearly the praise or adoration, not merely the admiration or the gratitude he deserves just for giving us life and breath. And so back to Jesus, a ton of folks are about to get fed, even though he and his disciples hadn't had enough time to eat. And when the feeding of the 5,000 gets done, the question is, well, what does Jesus get out of this? And really, there's no indication here he gets anything out of them, anything that he would want. You know, they're trying to make him king. He doesn't want that. So he does this without any expectation of return. And so here's the first things that when you get home every day, roll out the welcome mat, if you can still find it, and start eagerly meeting some front burner need that your wife has expressed to you, even if you're pretty sure there's nothing in it for you. She's probably not going to bow down and worship you. She's not going to call her mom and tell her how wonderful you turned out to be after all. Availability is a stealth word for another word that's harder and heavier. It's the word sacrifice. And so we have the definition there, a readiness to sacrifice what you want for what she needs. You could even reverse that, what you need, like your new fishing pole, for what she wants, or what you both need, or what you both want. Doesn't matter how you say it. It's just you want to do what Jesus would do. An example would be, your wife needs unhurried conversation. This is all women. With you listening and asking insightful and gentle questions and providing serious input from your different and superior male perspective. Now, if Jesus knew your wife needed that, then would he possibly set aside his ball game and be available? Or if she were sick, and let's say he doesn't heal her immediately, but you can imagine Jesus carrying her and pampering her and expressing a little sympathy. Or does he go bowling with his buddies while she's lying in bed with a 103-degree fever? Understand what I'm driving at here. So here's where you could start. Go home and scare her by meeting some practical need that she's been waiting for a long time for you to meet, if you can think of one. And so BJ is in the second row making a list, and I knew I shouldn't preach on this. Anyway. So now we're on our way, freeing ourselves to love and serve our wives better with availability. But we need to take a next step, and that would be a C word, compassion. So let's go to verse 12. Now the day began to wear away, and by the way, wear away doesn't mean it's getting dark or anything like that. Wear away means the sun is past its peak. It could be mid-afternoon, something like that. And the 12 came and said to him, "Send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions, for we are in a desolate place, not a 7-Eleven, Starbucks, or teriyaki place within sight." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." Just didn't want to send the people away without providing food. Now, if I can import some of the reasoning from the feeding of the 4,000, which will happen after this, it's not in Luke, but it is in Mark, chapter 8. Jesus said, "I feel compassion for the crowd because they've been with me." It's a little different situation, but they've been with me for 3 days now. They have nothing to eat. If I send them back to their homes hungry, they'll collapse on the road. Some of them have come quite a distance. Now, you see a lot of the heart of Jesus in that. Jesus himself labels the heart attitude that underlies what he does, no doubt in both situations, compassion, which I'm going to define as thoughtfully, empathetically, understandingly, doing your best to avert any anticipated pain of the other at your expense. That definition fits this situation especially. So, the Greek word in Mark for Compassion is the same word that we had last week from Philippians, the tenderness of Christ, his affection. It's something that's gotten to him on the inside. It's the bow word. He hurts with them. The English word compassion comes from Latin roots that mean to feel with somebody. It's feeling a genuine sympathy or sorrow with a strong desire to alleviate the pain or distress of the other, whether coming in the future or already existing then. It's not the same as pity. Pity is feeling sorry for someone, not necessarily moved to take action. Pity is when you see emaciated kids on the morning news and it ruins your breakfast. Compassion is when you send them breakfast. You understand the difference? So compassion. The direction of compassion is usually one way. It's feeling what they're feeling without demanding that they feel what you're feeling or what you're needing. It's a curious question whether the crowd had any interest in the feelings of Jesus. But Jesus is not hanging back waiting for them to say, we feel your pain, Lord, you haven't eaten anything, and here we are, you came here needing food and rest and some privacy, and we're sorry for bugging you. How can we help you? Maybe we should just leave. Jesus isn't waiting for that. All he's thinking about is that these people have nothing to eat. They're out of food to the point where Jesus can see they're in trouble if they travel on an empty stomach. They might collapse in weariness or maybe dehydration. I looked up the mean temperature at Passover time, which this was in Israel, and it's 74 degrees. So if you're out in the sun, walking there in the first place and then out in the sun that day, you could be dehydrated severely. And what this tells us is that Jesus is aware and cares about all of this. Even though these people are largely selfish and they just want something from him, we've got a lot to learn from a heart like his. He doesn't minimize their hardships just because their responses to him aren't what he would want. Some of them have even come a long way, and he sees that, and he cares. Stu Weber writes several books about men being men, and this is something he said to us men. Think about it. Christ did not come to earth for himself, but for you. Your marriage is not given to you for you. It is given to you for her. Your marriage is not a gift for your satisfaction. It is a labor for her development. She is not a gratuity to you. You are a sacrifice for her. You are not drawn to her for her beauty. You are to render her beautiful through your own pain. Do you hear Ephesians 5 in that? Where Paul commanded husbands to love their wife as Jesus did, who gave himself up for his bride. Now, it's interesting that Paul never asked wives to do the same thing. He puts this on men. So, compassion. Compassion always includes a sincere effort to understand or to get into the other person's shoes. And in this case, imagine like Jesus did, how perilous it would be to collapse far from home. Plus, he knew how much effort they had made to get where he was. So what if you started telling yourself, you great husbands, my wife is probably putting a lot more into our marriage than I even realize. Maybe I should consider what I deserve as a sinner. After all, I'm not Jesus. And say in all truth, my wife already treats me better than I deserve. And this gives us another resolution, which for some of us it would be a revolution. I will keep my spirit open to my wife by reminding myself regularly that she already treats me better than I deserve. And I could finish that with this, because what I deserve is hell. If I ever had one good day with her, that was way more than I deserve. And then armed with that humbled attitude, consider with a little empathy all the pressures on her and what she would have to set aside in order to prioritize me. She could already be exhausted for how far she had to travel to come to my direction. Did I even notice? And what about the hurts and wounds of her past, or maybe a present illness, or a nagging anxiety, or a special trial like caring for a sick parent? Things that weigh her down. Grew up watching my dad serve his invalid wife, my mom. Was often impatient with him and ungrateful, sometimes severely dissatisfied with him. Yet he always cut her a lot of slack and made allowance for her distress. He didn't let her demanding attitude stop him from loving her, serving her, and enjoying her. But if your heart is indifferent and unfeeling, it could mean your wife actually has many unspoken needs she figures you're not even interested to know about. She doesn't even bother to tell you because your indifference would only add to the load. Compassion. Compassion. Let's add a third item to our servant repertoire. It starts with a G, starting with verse 13b. It's the word generosity. Now, I know you guys are the big, you're the head of your home, but look, Jesus was the King of Kings, and he serves all these people, and he does so with great abundance. You might think that serving your life is like letting her be the boss. But no, you don't serve your wife because she's your master. You serve your wife because God is your master. Let me say that again. You do not serve your wife because she's your master. You serve her because God's your master. So some guys, they think leadership means starting to act like a drill sergeant. I was reading about a guy who, he was commuting on a train back from work, and he read this book called Man of the House. And he got home, and he pushed open the door, and he pointed his finger at his wife, and he said, "From now on, I want you to know that I am the man of this house, and my word is law. Tonight, you are to prepare me a gourmet meal and a sumptuous dessert, and then when I'm done eating, you're going to draw me a bath so I can have a relaxing soak. And when I'm finished with my bath, guess who's going to dress me and comb my hair?" And his wife responded, my guess is the funeral director. Now, the disciples of Jesus had a few things to learn about servanthood too. And they said, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish unless we go and buy food for all these people. Now, the other Gospels divulge that they counted up their money and it was way too little. For there were about 5,000 males there. And Matthew 14 tells us that didn't count the women and the children that were there. So it could have been double that or even more. Yesterday I went and got a Big Mac. It was $6.50. So for that many people, 10,000 people, that's $65,000. They weren't carrying that kind of cash around. Okay, so we get that. But the disciples are trying to think up some non-miraculous way to feed that crowd. And some people say they were wrong in that, but that's not exactly bad. These guys had not been trained by Jesus to automatically think that he would pull out a miracle every time a need cropped up. I mean, they had a pretty good-sized traveling troupe that had needed food many times. I don't think anyone thinks that Jesus dropped a fresh miracle for lunch every day. Big Macs and Diet Cokes all around. I think that didn't happen. They would be walking along. They would pluck grain from the fields. And, they had a team of women that actually, out of their means, helped them supplying needs for this troop. But here's the important point. Jesus often put his men in position where natural resources were insufficient. For instance, right after this miracle, he will send his guys across the lake straight into the teeth of the wind. And he wanted them to get to the end of themselves before he stepped in with a miracle. In that case, then he walked to them on the water, and then he stopped the storm. But here's what Jesus wants them to admit right here. This task is too big for us in this remote place. And we're over our heads. We need your help. We've counted everything up, and we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish, and that's it. So men, for us to learn our weakness, inadequacy, Jesus doesn't give us waves, he gives us wives. All right? That if you want to preserve your macho pride, then never get married, because you will find out that you are not enough for this. That's God's main purpose, because men in their pride need to be humbled. So guys, ask yourself another question. When what I, as a husband, have is not enough, which is usually the case, I will say always the case, and especially in her opinion, do I give up trying, or do I give what little I have and put it in the hand of God? Do I trust him? In this case, it was 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. What says, and he said to his disciples, there we go. And he said to his disciples, have them sit down in groups of 50 each. And they did so and had them all sit down. Now, this is springtime. In fact, Mark tells us the grass there was even green. This was 1 year before Jesus would be crucified. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing over them. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. Now, you may not have thought about this, but in spite of this miracle, this act of distributing food to so many people was a lot of work. Let's guess there was a minimum of, let's say, 10,000 people to serve, counting all the men and their families, but maybe a lot more. So this divine chef and his 12 willing workers would be working nonstop for a minimum of 2 hours if they could each serve 10 people per minute. I don't know if that's a lot or a little. I've never tried to do this with a big group like that. None of us have. But I tried to do the math, and that's what I came up with. It'd take a couple of hours. So remember, daylight will be receding, and they would have to work at top speed to get these people fed and off toward their lodgings. And then don't forget that these servers are already bushed. You know, it sounds a lot like you coming home from your job and realizing that's not all your wife needs from you. So there you have another fact of godly servanthood. And let's call this a resolution. Resolved. I will man up to the fact that it's going to take work to meet her needs, even with a miracle, plus cleanup. All right? And some wives are thinking getting my husband to clean up the kitchen would itself be a miracle. No one even laughed on that one. That's amazing. All right, so then verse 17. And they all ate and were satisfied. And what was left over was picked up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. Leftovers, and the sheer abundance of them shows this miracle was amazing, showing that no one needed to go away hungry. If they did, it was on them. There was more left over than what he started with. And so we're meant to be impressed by the massive scope of this miracle. Remember that a big part of why Luke is writing is so that when we read about Jesus, our jaws will drop. These people will depart full and satisfied. But the reason is this, because of the kind of servanthood that Jesus lives by. That's why they had so much, this abundance. He lives by, I mean that in the present tense right now. He is satisfying us, even with his word and all of that, in abundance. More than we even need. He doesn't hold back anything. He isn't stingy or resentful. He intends us to be the same way. And so we should ask our soul, what I actually often ask myself, who told you, Bruce, that being a servant was going to cost Jesus, but not you? As if he would do all of the suffering and then I would have none. No, I'm supposed to take this on myself in a servanthood like Jesus. So here's the third idea from our passage. Let's define this generosity, offering all the resources at my disposal, if possible, in abundance. Christ-like servant releases all his strength and his creativity, even if he's not sure it's enough. That's up to God. And you might be thinking, hey, Bruce, I'm no miracle man. What I have for my wife is not enough. It just seems like it's never enough. And I say, well, great. You're right where Jesus wants you. Just bring him all you have. Your 5 little loaves and your 2 fish, and put them in his hands. The rest is up to the Lord. If you can't be Jesus, at least be the lunch. The Bishop of London, and I love what he said. This is at the marriage of the royal couple, April 29th, 2011. You might have watched this on TV. I did. The wedding of William and Kate. And the bishop was complaining that in our day, people try to do marriage without including the presence of God. And he said, it can't be done without God's help, even if you're married to a princess. I had to put that in there for all you ladies. The princesses of Fellowship Bible Church. Now we're ready for a fourth aspect of Christ-like servanthood. And we've had availability, compassion, and generosity, and now gratitude. And this is crucial. The level of grief and frustration we feel, it could be drastically reduced if we could just adopt this perspective. And I want you to recall, who does all the thanking in this passage? Does even one person say thanks to Jesus? Well, not that we hear. I mean, some of them might have. When 10 lepers were healed, one of them went back and said thank you, 10%. But here it doesn't single out anyone for saying thanks. Well, just one. Jesus. He took the bread and the fish in his hands in verse 16. He looked up to heaven and he said a blessing over them. which means he honored them as a gift from God. He gave thanks. I think about him doing that, and I just realized that that is a very humbling perspective. That's what we call gratitude. And gratitude is putting the responsibility for thanks on my side. Not me getting thanks, but me giving it. Do you think that Jesus got many thank you notes from people after they got home that night without collapsing? I doubt it. Jesus prevented their collapse, but I would imagine that preventative care is hardly ever noticed. You don't usually thank someone for something that didn't happen. Don't expect your wife to be grateful for things that you quietly and modestly do for her. Even something practical, like, putting safe tires on her car, things that avert future problems. Or let's say yesterday you passed up Mariners tickets so that you could wash the outside house windows that you couldn't reach. It's a blessing to your wife, and she doesn't even know what you gave up for that, your sacrifice, unless you crow about it or you complain. Just as you don't know the many sacrifices she has quietly made to minister to you. So we're left with Jesus as the one who says thanks, and that's a Christ-like husband. He turns his heart and his eyes upward. He gives thanks to the Father. He's grateful for that little amount that he has to start with in his hands, even though the amount of bread and fish is not even there. A small amount is in his hands. He thanks God for it when it's still small. So what we see is Jesus in all gratitude, turning his heart vertically before he serves horizontally. And that's what it takes to be grateful. About 300 years ago, a famous English Bible scholar, Matthew Henry, was attacked by thieves who made off with his wallet. And he wrote these words in his diary. Let me be thankful. First, I was never robbed before. Second, although they took my purse, they didn't take my life. Third, although they took my all, it was not much. Fourth, let me be thankful because it was I who was robbed and not I who did the robbing. Now think about the difference it might make if you had a perspective like that. Let me explain that. Like where you say, if one of us, speaking of your wife, if one of us has to endure the pain of being unthanked, I'm glad it's me and not you or not her. Better that I should suffer rather than she. Plus, better that it wasn't I who sinned against her by being unthankful. I wouldn't want that sin on my own conscience. Let me be thankful for all of this. Now, I can give you a formula for a miserable marriage in case yours isn't painful enough already. Refuse to enjoy things where thanks and appreciation are withheld. See, a joyful servant can't afford to get hung up on whether he's appreciated. In fact, quite the opposite. He will make every effort to thank his wife for whatever she does for him. Billy Sunday said, try praising your wife even if it does frighten her at first. Tim Keller wrote a book called The Meaning of Marriage, and he was a pastor. He had his fair share of trials in ministry. He wrote, pastors often hear, I work my fingers to the bone in this church, and what thanks do I get? Is that the way it is? Your service was for thanks? Are you in your right mind? Servanthood begins where gratitude and applause end. So there's another great saying for your refrigerator. But now I'm really hardly suggesting that a wife should withhold thanks just to test her husband, to see if he's really a bona fide passing the Keller test guy. And of course, you should thank him and do so profusely and sincerely, especially on Father's Day. But I'm talking to husbands whose wives don't do that and may never will. And I'm asking guys to never give up serving her. But here's the deal. You can't be strong enough to maintain that. You have to put all this in the Lord's hands. This takes this larger perspective. You're grateful to God for giving you the opportunity to simply serve someone who has needs. You're grateful that some of your skills and time can be directed towards someone besides yourself. And if she isn't grateful for you and for what you do, that hurts. But what should grieve you even more is that she's probably not that grateful to God either. You're sad for God because now you know how it feels. Now that very insight could change a lot of things. It's an insight that could encourage you in a strange but transforming way. It could stop you from being unthankful to God because now you know how it feels. It could make you stop being bitter at your wife because you realize there's a silver lining to it. Or you could figure the joy part of it. Let me do this as a question. Can you get joy out of seeing how your wife's ingratitude has linked you to the precious heart of God, who has to endure ingratitude on an infinitely greater scale? Or this statement that's kind of a summary of all of this. Serving anybody with joy is not conditioned on how deeply you are understood or appreciated, but on how high a value you put on the incredible privilege of displaying the humble heart of Jesus. That's the joy of being a husband, no matter what your wife is like. So, resolved. I will thank God for my wife, even when she's difficult, because she provides an opportunity to love the way God loves difficult me. Now remember, I'm not saying any of you wives are, like tough cookies that are hard to love. I'm just trying to get across to your hubby, who might feel that you are sometimes, how he and I can stay engaged and joyful as a servant like Jesus. All right, so what do we do with this? Let's just kind of walk away with something here. You might be here and you maybe don't know anything about the Bible. You never even heard of Jesus. You don't even know if he was married or not. And you might be thinking, well, it's too bad Jesus never married. He would have made an awesome husband. Well, guess what? He is a husband. If you read Ephesians 5, you find out he's the ideal model husband. And I was thinking about it. You can be so glad that Jesus is a loving, patient servant like this because we all happen to be his bride. Isn't this amazing? So whatever your marriage is like, this one's off the charts. Now, the passage ends with the Lord's 12 men holding 12 baskets of broken pieces. And the leftovers. And this might imply that they finally get something to eat. Might also imply there wasn't a 13th basket for Jesus. I don't know. But anyway, we're told in the other Gospels that Jesus then sends the disciples away on the boat while Jesus sends the crowd home who are wanting to make him, a sugar daddy king, but he wouldn't have it. And then there's Jesus alone, hiking up the mountain. 5,000 plus people are now down to one. As night closes in, there's Jesus alone praying. Finally has what looks like world-class success, people demanding to elevate him to the throne, and he sends them away and he hikes up the hill alone. And obviously he's not thinking, hey, things are going so well, I don't need to pray anymore. I guess he could have marched to Jerusalem with 5,000 well-fed, motivated men organized in companies of 50. He could have taken the throne that really did belong to him. But he didn't, because he came to die, not to be served, but to serve and to give his life, a ransom for many. Imagine him on that dark hillside thinking of another hill outside the gates of Jerusalem, listening to the countdown of Calvary. There would be a crown all right, but not the one that the crowd was thinking of. There would be a crowd all right, but it won't be calling King him. They'll be shouting, crucify him. Jesus is thinking that getting to be their king the right way is going to involve dying. And he will tell his disciples that very thing twice in this very chapter. Jesus models what every man on his knees must know by heart to be a servant and a great husband. The measure of success is not what you get, but what you give, not how you have lived, but how much you have loved. Not how many crowns you wear, but, well, unless it's one made out of thorns, it is by dying that we truly live. You should learn something here on Father's Day. Go home to your humble castle and apply these things. And you say, Bruce, I thought I was going to hear a Father's Day message, and I heard a Husband's Day message. No, this is a Father's Day message. You want to be a great dad to your kids. Love and serve their mom. It is the greatest thing that you can do for them besides loving God. Love their mom. Love and serve her like Jesus. Yes, it will take a certain kind of dying. But the greatest beneficiaries of a servant-hearted, cross-humble dad will be your children, both sons and daughters. They will watch you serve their mother with daily helpings of joy, something that can happen inside them, especially if they know that at times you have loved her joyfully when she wasn't in a very good mood. And before they might have looked at their own future, they might have gotten nervous and afraid of getting married because it's hard. And what if they end up with someone hard to love, but now they see through you that there are obviously resources for love and joy? And when married to a Proverbs 21 woman, you thought it would say 31, but 21 is about the quarrelsome, frustrated woman. And they say, Mama ain't happy, but Daddy is, which means he's either sadistic or there's hope. They see Dad go up on the mountain and pray. And they will not measure their future by their own small resources, but by the Lord's ability to multiply a lunch and satisfy thousands. That's a Jesus-saturated man. And so, men, I urge you on Father's Day to apply these truths as you return home. Servanthood involves availability, compassion, generosity, and gratitude. You're not really going to get any of those unless you know and follow Jesus. Let him love your wife and kids through you. And let me close with one little thing. It's kind of a little bit off the side, but in this crazy election year, when pundits from all sides are saying the world is going to tip over if the election turns out a certain way, a final quotation from the great G.K. Chesterton is worth remembering. He said, "The greatest political crisis flutters only a fringe of humanity, but an ordinary man and an ordinary woman and their ordinary children literally alter the destiny of nations." You might call your dad and say, "Thank you for saving the planet." Let's pray. We do thank you, Lord, for all the dads in this room and all the fathers that raised the people in this room. Some of them were not good dads, and some of us aren't either. Every one of us could do better. We need your grace for this. We plead with you to help us. We come on our knees and ask that you would be to us the multiplier of loaves and fish, and help us to feed and direct our families in a way that satisfies them, and they go away satisfied when they're with us. We're not big enough for this, we know that. We confess we have not always done well because of our cotton-picking pride, because of the things in our heart that just pull away because we want attention and we want admiration and we want gratefulness and we want a perfect wife. And you've just called us to love her and serve her, adore her, be with her in a way that encourages her. So let us do that in your strength. In Jesus' name, amen.